When we think of deserts, we picture sand dunes, scorching heat, and scattered cactuses clinging to life. When we think of the ocean, we picture abundance, schools of fish, coral reefs teeming with color, whales breaching the surface in explosive displays of life. But here's what most people don't know. The deep sea, which makes up 65% of Earth's surface and 95% of its livable volume, is functionally a desert. Not metaphorically. Actually, a desert by almost every ecological measure that matters. So what makes a desert isn't really about sand or heat. It's about energy. And the deep ocean is one of the most energy-starved environments on our planet. The numbers tell an astonishing story. While a square meter of tropical rainforest floor might receive several grams of organic matter every single day, the abyssal seafloor, at depths beyond 4,000 meters, receives approximately 0.001 grams of carbon per square meter per day. That's the same energy input as the Sahara Desert. But unlike the Sahara, where you can at least see the barrenness, the deep ocean hides its poverty behind 4,000 meters of water. We've assumed that because the ocean is wet, it must be fertile. We've imagined the deep sea as this dark but rich frontier, teeming with undiscovered monsters and alien ecosystems. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to dismantle that assumption, because understanding that the deep sea is a desert changes everything about how we think about the largest habitat on Earth, and what it means that we're making it even more barren. Here's the fundamental problem with being an ecosystem. 4 kilometers underwater, you're completely cut off from the sun. Photosynthesis stops at about 200 meters depth. Below that point, there's not a single organism that can create food from sunlight. Not one. Every calorie that sustains life in the deep must fall from above, a process marine biologists call marine snow. But here's where the math becomes brutal. When a phytoplankton dies at the surface, or a fish produces waste, or any organic matter begins to sink, it doesn't fall through empty water. It falls through what's essentially a gauntlet of hungry mouths, stretching for kilometers. Marine snow sinks at roughly 50 to 200 meters per day. That means it takes weeks to reach the abyssal plains. And during that entire journey, it's being eaten, decomposed by bacteria, and broken down into smaller and smaller particles. Every meter it falls, there are organisms waiting to consume it. So by the time anything reaches 4,000 meters depth, only 1 to 2% of the original organic matter remains. In some parts of the deep Pacific, it's even less, as little as 0.5%. Let's put that in perspective. Imagine a rainforest where only 1% of the leaves that fell from the canopy actually reached the forest floor. The other 99% just vanished into thin air on the way down. That's the deep sea. It's living on the scraps of scraps of scraps. But it gets worse. This isn't a constant drizzle of food. Marine snow follows seasonal patterns based on surface productivity. In many parts of the deep ocean, there are literal famine months where almost nothing falls from above. A researcher named Craig Smith documented this in the abyssal North Pacific. He placed time-lapse cameras on the seafloor and tracked food arrival over 2 years. What he found was shocking. Some months, the seafloor received almost zero organic input. The bottom would sit there in total darkness, at near freezing temperatures, under crushing pressure, with absolutely nothing to eat. It was the equivalent of a desert going months without rain. So deep sea organisms don't just live in an energy-poor environment. They live in an unpredictable one. They've evolved in a place where food scarcity isn't occasional. It's the default state. Abundance is the anomaly. This creates what ecologists call an energy bottleneck. And energy bottlenecks determine everything. how many species can exist, how many individuals survive, how large they can grow, how fast they can reproduce, how quickly they can recover from disturbance. The deep sea has one of the most severe energy bottlenecks on Earth, which brings us to the second desert characteristic. Almost nothing lives there. In 2010, a global research team led by Qilin Wei compiled something that had never been done before: a comprehensive map of seafloor biomass across all the world's oceans. They analyzed data from hundreds of research cruises spanning decades, measuring the actual weight of living tissue in different ocean zones. What they found was a biological wasteland. The average continental shelf, that shallow underwater extension of continents, contains between 10 and 100 grams of living tissue per square meter. Coral reefs can reach even higher densities. These are vibrant, productive ecosystems where energy is abundant and life packs in tight. But when you move off the shelf and descend into the abyss, biomass collapses. The average abyssal plain contains just 0.01 to 1 gram per square meter. That's a 100 to 1,000-fold decrease. So in terms of sheer living matter, the deep sea floor is comparable to the Sahara Desert, which averages 0.1 to 5 grams per square meter. Some parts of the deep ocean are actually more barren than the driest deserts on land. This isn't just about weight. It's about encounter probability. If you were swimming through the bathypelagic zone, that's 1,000 to 4,000 meters depth, you might encounter less than one fish per 1,000 cubic meters of water. That's a cube of water 10 meters on each side, and it's essentially empty. Imans Preed, who spent decades studying deep-sea fish populations, put baited cameras on the seafloor to attract scavengers. In productive shallow waters, fish arrive within minutes. But in the abyssal zone, it sometimes took hours for the first fish to appear. Hours for a free meal sitting in the open, releasing scent into the water. That's not because the fish are slow. It's because there are almost no fish to arrive. But the scarcity goes beyond just numbers. It affects diversity itself. A study by Michael Rex analyzed deep-sea biodiversity patterns across multiple ocean basins over decades of sampling. What he found was a clear correlation. As energy availability decreased with depth, so did the number of species that could coexist. Coral reefs can support over 1,000 species per hectare. Tropical forests support hundreds of tree species alone in that same area. But abyssal plains typically support only 20 to 50 megafauna species per hectare, and that's counting everything visible to the naked eye. So the deep sea isn't just sparse, it's fundamentally less diverse than shallow ecosystems. Energy scarcity doesn't just reduce populations, it reduces the number of ecological niches that can exist. Think about what that means. Desert ecosystems have specialists, cacti that store water in their flesh, kangaroo rats that never drink, reptiles that can go months without eating. The deep sea has the same pattern, but taken to extremes. But here's what makes the deep sea particularly remarkable. These organisms aren't just rare. Many species are known from only single specimens. In 2020, researchers discovered a new species of snailfish in the Mariana Trench at 8,336 meters, the deepest fish ever recorded. They caught one individual, one fish, 8 kilometers down. In an area we've explored repeatedly with state-of-the-art equipment. So what we're looking at isn't an ocean teeming with undiscovered life. We're looking at a vast, dark desert where life is scattered so thinly that even after decades of exploration, we're still finding species from single individuals. This is the deep ocean's second desert characteristic: biological poverty on a planetary scale. When you're living in a desert, whether sand or water, your body becomes a calculator. Every movement, every heartbeat, every calorie spent on growth or reproduction is a transaction you might not be able to afford. So deep-sea organisms have evolved some of the most extreme energy conservation strategies known to biology. Let's start with metabolism. Jeffrey Drazen and Brad Siebel conducted a landmark study in 2007 where they measured the metabolic rates of fish at different depths. They actually caught live fish, measured their oxygen consumption, and calculated how much energy they were burning just to stay alive. What they found was a consistent pattern. For every 1,000 meters you descend, metabolic rate drops by roughly 20 to 30%. A rat-tail fish living at 4,000 meters burns calories at less than half the rate of its shallow water relatives. It moves slower. It grows slower. Its heart beats slower. It lives its entire life in what's essentially biological slow motion. But this isn't sluggishness. It's precision engineering. These fish have reduced their muscle mass to the minimum required for survival. Many deep-sea fish have gelatinous, watery flesh instead of dense muscle tissue. Their bones are thin and fragile, barely calcified. Some species have reduced their skeletons so much they're essentially cartilaginous. Why? Because in an energy-starved environment, every gram of tissue you don't absolutely need is a liability. Muscle tissue is expensive to build and expensive to maintain. Bone requires calcium and phosphorus. Every cell you grow is a cell you have to feed for your entire life. Desert plants reduce their leaves to spines to minimize water loss. Deep-sea fish reduce their bodies to near-transparent shadows to minimize energy expenditure. So, when food does arrive, they've developed ways to make absolutely sure they don't miss the opportunity. The black swallower, a deep-sea fish barely 25 centimeters long, can swallow fish twice its own length. Its stomach is distensible, meaning it can expand to many times its normal size. Its jaw can unhinge. Its skin can stretch. Researchers have found black swallowers that died because they ate prey so large it decomposed before they could digest it, filling them with gas and floating them to the surface where they were discovered bloated and dead. That's not poor planning. That's the rational strategy of an organism that might not eat again for months. When you encounter food in a desert, you don't take what you need. You take everything you can possibly carry. But perhaps the most extreme adaptation involves reproduction. And this is where the deep sea gets truly strange. In 1925, a British ichthyologist named Charles Tate Regan was examining anglerfish specimens when he noticed something peculiar. What he initially thought were parasites attached to female anglerfish were actually males, permanently fused males. Male anglerfish are born with one purpose: find a female in the vast darkness. Their eyes are well developed. Their olfactory organs are huge. They can detect female pheromones across vast distances. When a male finds a female, he bites into her flesh and releases an enzyme that dissolves the skin of both fish at the contact point, fusing their circulatory systems together. The male becomes a permanent parasite, receiving all his nutrients from the female's bloodstream. In return, he provides sperm whenever she's ready to reproduce. Over time, the male's body atrophies. His eyes degenerate because he no longer needs to see. His internal organs disappear because he's no longer digesting food. His fins shrink. He becomes nothing but a sperm-producing appendage attached to the female, sometimes just a few centimeters long. Some females have been found with 6 or more males fused to their bodies. So why this grotesque strategy? Because in a desert, finding a mate might be the rarest event in your entire life. Population density in parts of the deep ocean is so low that some anglerfish species might have only one individual per several cubic kilometers of water. In that context, the probability of a sexually mature male encountering a sexually mature female at the right time in the right place is astronomically small. In the Sahara, desert plants produce thousands of seeds, knowing most will never find water. In the deep sea, male anglerfish surrender their entire bodies, their independence, their organs, their future, to guarantee reproduction happens if they're lucky enough to find a female. But the most telling adaptation is lifespan. This is where the deep sea as desert parallel becomes mathematically precise. Ecologists recognize a pattern called K-selection. In stable, resource-poor environments, organisms evolve to live longer, reproduce later, and have fewer offspring with higher parental investment. Desert tortoises live 80 years. Saguaro cacti live 200 years. They can afford to wait because their environment, while harsh, is predictable. Deep-sea organisms follow the exact same pattern. The orange roughy, a commercially fished deep-sea species, doesn't reach sexual maturity until age 20 to 30. It can live over 100 years. Think about that. This fish spends 3 decades just growing before it reproduces even once. Deep-sea corals have been radiocarbon dated to over 4,000 years old. 4,000 years. These organisms were already ancient when the pyramids were built. A deep-sea octopus was observed by researchers at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, brooding her eggs for 4.5 years. They monitored the same individual in the same spot, protecting her eggs for 53 months. That's the longest parental care period ever recorded in any animal. She didn't eat during that entire time. For 4.5 years, she sat in the darkness fanning her eggs with her tentacles to keep them oxygenated, growing weaker and weaker. When the eggs finally hatched, she died. So these aren't fast-living, fast-dying organisms. They're marathon survivors, eking out existence across decades or centuries, waiting for the rare moments when food appears, reproducing only after accumulating enough energy to give their offspring a chance. But every desert has its oases, and the deep ocean has some of the most spectacular oases on Earth, places where the desert analogy breaks down completely. In 1977, geologists were exploring the Galapagos Rift in a submersible called Alvin, looking for hydrothermal activity. They were expecting barren rock and maybe some bacterial mats. What they found changed biology forever. Surrounding cracks in the seafloor, where superheated water poured out from Earth's crust, they found dense clusters of life unlike anything known to science. Giant tube worms nearly 2.5 meters long. Masses of white crabs crawling over each other. Clusters of mussels. Bacterial mats covering the rocks in thick white carpets. In the middle of the deep-sea desert, at 2,500 meters depth, where almost nothing should be able to survive, there was an ecosystem with biomass 500 to 1,000 times higher than the surrounding seafloor. But here's what made it truly revolutionary. These organisms weren't living on energy from the sun. They were living on chemical energy from Earth's interior. Bacteria at these vents use hydrogen sulfide, which is toxic to most life, and convert it into organic matter through a process called chemosynthesis. They're not photosynthesizing, they're chemosynthesizing. These bacteria form the base of an entire food web that's completely independent of the sun. So hydrothermal vents are oases, not because they receive more food from above, but because they've found an entirely different energy source. They're the equivalent of a desert spring fed by underground aquifers, a completely separate water source that allows life to flourish in the middle of barrenness. The parallel extends even further. Just like desert oases, Hydrothermal vents are isolated islands separated by vast stretches of barrenness. A vent field might be hundreds of kilometers from the nearest neighboring vent. Species at one vent are often genetically isolated from the next, evolving in island-like populations. And just like oases, they're temporary. Hydrothermal vents are driven by volcanic activity. When the geology shifts, the vent shuts off, the water stops flowing, the bacteria die, the entire ecosystem collapses. Some vents last for decades, some last for centuries, but none last forever. But there's another kind of oasis in the deep sea, one that's mobile, unpredictable, and utterly spectacular. When a whale dies and sinks to the seafloor, it brings with it roughly 2,000 kilograms of organic carbon. That's equivalent to 200 years' worth of normal food input to that area of seafloor. It's not a spring, it's a flash flood in the desert. Craig Smith pioneered the study of whale falls and documented something remarkable. These carcasses support 4 distinct successional stages over 50 to 100 years. First, mobile scavengers arrive: hagfish, sleeper sharks, rat tails. They can smell the carcass from kilometers away. Within days, they're stripping the soft tissue in a feeding frenzy that can remove hundreds of kilograms of flesh in months. Then, opportunistic species colonize the bones. Worms, crustaceans, mollusks move in and feed on the remaining scraps. Then, specialized bacteria break down the lipids inside the bones themselves. Whale bones are extremely oily, and these lipids provide energy for decades. Finally, the bones themselves become reef-like structures, providing hard substrate in an otherwise muddy environment. Species settle on them. The skeleton becomes a habitat. A single whale fall can support over 400 species, including dozens found nowhere else on Earth. Some species exist only on whale falls. They've evolved specifically to exploit this rare ephemeral resource. So the deep ocean is a desert punctuated by rare oases, vents that appear and disappear on geological timescales, and whale falls that arrive like unpredictable rainstorms, bringing brief abundance to a world defined by scarcity. Here's the terrible irony. We're making the deep sea desert even more barren. And we're doing it in ways most people never consider. Climate change is warming the surface ocean. But the deep ocean is cold, and it's going to stay cold. That's not the problem. The problem is what warming does to the surface layers. As surface water warms, it becomes less dense. Warm water floats. This creates stronger stratification, essentially a more rigid boundary between warm surface water and cold deep water. And that stratification acts like a lid, so nutrients that would normally upwell from the deep to fertilize surface phytoplankton stay trapped below. Surface productivity declines. Phytoplankton blooms become less intense. Less organic matter is produced at the surface, and when surface productivity declines, even less food falls to the deep. A 2017 study by Andrew Sweetman modeled future food supply to the deep ocean under various climate scenarios. The projections were stark. By 2100, particulate organic carbon flux to the abyssal seafloor could decline by 10 to 30%. That might not sound catastrophic, but remember, these ecosystems are already surviving on 1% of surface production. They're already in permanent famine. A 30% reduction in food supply to an environment already living on the edge is ecological collapse. Species that have survived for millions of years could go extinct, not because we hunted them, but because we made their desert slightly more barren. But we're not just starving the deep ocean, we're directly destroying it. Deep-sea mining companies are currently planning to extract polymetallic nodules from the abyssal plains. These potato-sized rocks sit on the seafloor and contain rare earth elements valuable for electronics and batteries. They also take millions of years to form. They grow at rates of millimeters per million years. When mining equipment vacuums up these nodules, it destroys everything in its path. The nodules themselves are habitats. Organisms live on them, under them, attached to them. The mining equipment crushes everything. The sediment plumes created by mining can spread for tens of kilometers, smothering organisms that have never experienced disturbance in their multi-century lifespans. These animals evolved in one of the most stable environments on Earth. They have no adaptations for recovering from catastrophic disturbance because catastrophic disturbance has never happened. The recovery time for these ecosystems isn't measured in years or decades. It's measured in millennia. A study in the Peru Basin examined mining tracks made in 1989 just for testing purposes, just to see what would happen. More than 30 years later, the seafloor had not recovered. The tracks were still visible. Biodiversity had not returned to pre-disturbance levels. The ecosystem remained damaged. So we're about to industrially mine an ecosystem that recovers slower than any other on Earth, in an environment we've barely explored, to extract resources that took millions of years to accumulate, and we're doing it to a desert that can't afford to lose anything. The deep ocean doesn't have the resilience of a rainforest, where a cleared patch can regrow in decades. It has the resilience of a desert, where a single disruption can echo for geological time. But unlike terrestrial deserts, which we can see and monitor and protect, the deep ocean suffers in darkness. Out of sight, out of mind. We're destroying something most people don't even know exists. We've explored less than 5% of the deep ocean. We have better maps of Mars than we do of the abyssal plains. We have higher resolution images of distant galaxies than we do of most of the seafloor. But what we have discovered tells a consistent story. The deep sea is not the last frontier of abundance. It's the largest desert on Earth. It's a desert defined not by lack of water, but by lack of energy. Not by heat, but by cold. Not by light, but by absolute darkness. Not by sand, but by fine sediment that hasn't been disturbed in millions of years. And like all deserts, it's more fragile than it appears. The organisms living there have spent millions of years adapting to scarcity. They've slowed their metabolisms to near Ting-G. They've extended their lifespans to centuries. They've developed strategies so extreme they seem like science fiction. Males fusing to females, fish swallowing prey larger than themselves, octopuses brooding eggs for half a decade. They've learned to survive on almost nothing. But they haven't learned to survive us, because we're not just passing through this desert. We're not just observing it. We're removing what little it has. We're reducing the already minimal food supply through climate change. We're planning to mine the substrate. We're extracting the few concentrated resources, fish, minerals, genetic material, that exist. So the question isn't whether the deep sea is a desert. The evidence is overwhelming that it is. The question is, what do we do with the largest, least explored, most energy-starved habitat on our planet? Do we recognize its fragility and protect it? Do we acknowledge that some places are too slow, too poor, too vulnerable to exploit? Or do we treat it like we've treated so many terrestrial deserts, as empty spaces to be used because we can't see what we're destroying? The deep ocean is a desert, and like all deserts, it's far more alive and far more vulnerable than it appears.